The desert had a way of swallowing sound. Nora Blake had learned this in her first week at the Route 66 diner, when the silence between customers stretched so long she could hear her own heartbeat echoing in her ears. Now, 3 years later, she'd grown comfortable with the quiet, comfortable with the emptiness, comfortable with being forgotten. The afternoon sun hung low over the Arizona highway, casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt parking lot. Heat shimmered in waves above the pavement, creating mirages that disappeared the moment you looked directly at them. The diner sat like an island in an ocean of sand and scrubgrass, its faded turquoise paint and rusted chrome trim, a relic from an era when this route meant something, when people traveled slowly enough to notice places like this. Inside, the air conditioning hummed its perpetual battle against the desert heat. The black and white checkered floor gleamed from Nora's morning cleaning, and the red vinyl booths showed their age in carefully patched tiers and faded sections, where thousands of travelers had slid in and out over decades. The smell of coffee, always coffee, mixed with the lingering scent of the lunch special. Meatloaf today, same as every Thursday. Nora stood behind the counter, 27 years old, but carrying herself with a stillness that made her seem both younger and older simultaneously. Her dark blonde hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her diner uniform, pale blue dress with white collar and apron, hung loose on her frame as if she'd deliberately chosen a size too large. Her face was pleasant but unmemorable, the kind of face that people looked at and immediately forgot. She'd worked hard to make it that way, but her eyes told a different story. They were gray-green, and they never stopped moving. Even now, as she wiped down the already clean counter for the third time, her gaze swept the diner in a pattern. Entrance, windows, kitchen door, back exit, repeat. Always cataloging, always assessing, always ready. "You gonna polish a hole right through that counter, hun?" called May from the kitchen pass-through. The older woman's weathered face appeared in the window, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she checked the pie inventory. "We got customers or not?" "Not," Nora replied, her voice quiet and measured. "Just Jimmy over at booth 7. Jimmy was a regular, a long-haul trucker who stopped every Thursday on his route between Phoenix and Albuquerque. He sat in his usual spot, working through his usual order, coffee, black, and a slice of apple pie, while reading the day-old newspaper. He never bothered anyone, never asked questions. That was why Nora liked him. Slow day, May sighed, disappearing back into the kitchen. Again, slow was good, Nora thought. Slow was safe. Slow meant routine, and routine meant she could breathe. She moved to refill Jimmy's coffee, her steps silent despite the worn linoleum. Years of practice had taught her how to move through spaces without drawing attention, how to be present but invisible. She poured the coffee with steady hands, exchanged nods with Jimmy, and returned to her position behind the counter. Through the large front windows, she could see the highway stretching in both directions, a gray ribbon cutting through the copper and gold landscape. A tumbleweed rolled lazily across the parking lot. In the distance, the mountains rose like jagged teeth against the pale blue sky, their peaks sharp and unforgiving. Nora had chosen this place carefully, remote enough to discourage curious visitors, close enough to civilization that she could disappear into Phoenix if needed, anonymous enough that no one asked questions about a young woman working a dead-end job in the middle of nowhere. The owner, May's husband Frank, had hired her without checking references. Cash business, simple work, no complications. She'd been running for 3 years. No, not running. That implied panic, desperation. She'd been strategically relocating, maintaining operational security, creating space between who she'd been and who she needed to become. The only problem was that she couldn't quite figure out who that new person was supposed to be. Her hands moved automatically through the familiar tasks, restocking napkin dispensers, checking salt and pepper shakers, organizing the silverware. Muscle memory from countless repetitions. Her mind, however, wandered to places she tried to keep locked away. She thought about the weight of tactical gear, the sound of helicopter rotors, the taste of fear mixed with adrenaline. She thought about faces she'd never see again and promises she couldn't keep. She thought about the moment everything changed, the moment her carefully constructed military career had collapsed like a house of cards in a desert windstorm. "Stop it," she whispered to herself, so quietly the words barely disturbed the air. The bell above the door chimed. Nora's head snapped up, her body automatically shifting into a posture of readiness that she immediately forced herself to relax. Just a customer, just someone passing through, like everyone else. Except they weren't like everyone else. The man who entered moved with a precision that made Nora's trained eye immediately categorize him as a potential threat. Mid-40s, she estimated, with dark hair showing distinguished gray at the temples. He wore an expensive charcoal suit that should have looked ridiculous in a roadside diner, but instead seemed perfectly natural on him, as if he carried his own atmosphere wherever he went. His face was handsome in a classical way, strong jaw, dark eyes that missed nothing, a mouth that looked like it rarely smiled but knew how. 2 other men followed him inside, younger, broader, wearing dark clothes that couldn't quite hide the tension in their shoulders. They moved like bodyguards, which meant the first man was someone who needed guarding. The afternoon light streaming through the windows seemed to dim, as if the desert itself recognized something significant had just walked through the door. Jimmy looked up from his newspaper, glanced at the newcomers, and quickly returned his attention to his pie. Even he, in his simple trucking routine, recognized when to mind his own business. Nora's heart rate increased. Not panic, just elevated awareness. She'd learned to read people in another life, in places where reading wrong could get you or others hurt. These men carried themselves with a specific kind of confidence, the kind that came from knowing they were dangerous and not caring who knew it. The first man's eyes swept the diner with the same systematic assessment Nora herself had been doing moments before. When his gaze landed on her, she felt it like a physical weight. He looked at her not as a waitress, not as scenery, but as a person to be evaluated and categorized. She met his eyes for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to acknowledge him, not long enough to challenge, and then dropped her gaze in the universal gesture of service industry deference. "Afternoon, gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying the practiced warmth of professional hospitality with none of the genuine feeling behind it. "Sit anywhere you'd like. Menus on the tables." The man nodded once, a gesture so economical it conveyed acknowledgement without wasting unnecessary movement. He chose a booth in the back corner, the one that gave a clear view of both the entrance and the kitchen door. His companions flanked him, one sliding in beside him, the other taking the opposite bench. Nora gave them 30 seconds to settle before approaching with water glasses and silverware. Another practiced routine. Smile. Friendly, but not too friendly. Eye contact, brief and professional. Pen poised over notepad. "What can I get for you today?" she asked. The man in the suit studied the laminated menu with the same intensity someone might give to a legal contract. His hands were clean and well-maintained, but she noticed the slight calluses on his knuckles. Someone who'd learned to handle himself physically before learning to delegate such matters to others. "Coffee," he said. His voice was deep and carried a slight accent. Italian, perhaps, smoothed by years in America but never quite erased. "Black. And the pie. What kind is good?" "Apple's fresh today," Nora replied. "May makes it from scratch every morning." "Apple, then." He handed back the menu. "For all of us." His companions nodded their agreement, though they hadn't looked at the menu at all. They kept their attention on the windows, on the door, on the angles of approach. Professionals doing professional work. Nora collected the menus. This was the moment she should have turned and walked away, should have returned to the kitchen, prepared their order, maintained the simple transaction of customer and server. Instead, she paused. Something about the way the man held himself, the quality of his attention, triggered a recognition she couldn't quite name. Not who he was. She'd never seen him before in her life, but what he represented. Authority. Power. The kind of person who made decisions that rippled outward in ways the decision-maker himself might never see. In her previous life, she'd met people like this, had briefed them, worked alongside them, occasionally had to stand against them. They existed in the shadows between official channels and unofficial operations, in the spaces where normal rules bent or broke. And in that previous life, she'd learned specific protocols for addressing specific people in specific situations. Without thinking, moving on instinct buried so deep it preceded conscious thought, Nora performed a slight bow, not a dramatic gesture. Anyone watching might have mistaken it for a simple nod, but her hands moved to her sides in a particular position, and her head tilted at a precise angle, and for just a fraction of a second she exhibited a respect that went beyond simple service. It was a greeting, an acknowledgement, a sign of recognition used in very specific circles, taught to her by someone trying to bridge cultures and create understanding in situations where misunderstanding could lead to serious consequences. She realized what she'd done the instant she straightened. The man had gone completely still. His dark eyes, which had been casually observing her, now locked onto her face with an intensity that made the air feel thick. She saw the exact moment recognition flashed across his features. Confusion, then shock, then something harder and more dangerous. Suspicion. One of his companions leaned forward slightly, murmuring something in Italian. The man raised a hand, a gesture that commanded silence without saying a word. "Where?" he said, his voice quiet but carrying absolute authority. "Did you learn to do that?" Nora's mind raced. She could play dumb, claim she didn't know what he was talking about, could pretend it was just a habit, something meaningless she'd picked up somewhere. But the look in his eyes told her he wouldn't accept easy lies. She started, then stopped. "Nowhere important. Just, someone taught me. A long time ago. Someone taught you." He repeated her words slowly, as if tasting them for truth. That specific gesture, that particular angle. Someone just taught you that. She didn't answer. Couldn't answer. Because the truth was complicated, wrapped up in classified operations and confidential briefings in situations she'd sworn never to discuss with anyone who didn't have clearance to know. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Jimmy chose that moment to stand, dropping a $5 bill on his table and heading for the door without looking at anyone. Smart man. Whatever was happening here, he wanted no part of it. The bell chimed again as he left, and then the diner was empty except for Nora, May somewhere in the kitchen, and 3 men who were looking at her like she was a puzzle that needed solving. "I'll get your coffee," Nora said, stepping back. "Wait." Not loud, not aggressive, but absolutely commanding. She stopped. "What's your name?" "Nora." "Nora." He said it like he was filing it away for future reference. "And you work here? In this diner? In the middle of the desert?" "I do." "For how long?" 3 years. And before that? This was dangerous ground. Questions led to answers. Answers led to more questions. And eventually questions led to places she couldn't afford to go. "Before that isn't really relevant to your order, sir," she said, keeping her voice level and professional. "I'll get that coffee for you." She turned and walked toward the kitchen, feeling his eyes on her back every step of the way. Her hands were steady as she poured 3 cups of coffee, cut 3 slices of apple pie, arranged everything on a tray. But inside, her thoughts were spinning. Stupid. Stupid, stupid, stupid. 3 years of keeping her head down, maintaining perfect operational security. And she'd blown it with a muscle memory response to a man whose presence had triggered something she'd thought she'd buried. That gesture was old. Specific. She'd learned it from a contact in Okinawa, someone who'd moved between military intelligence circles and older, more traditional organizations. It was a sign of respect used in very particular contexts, by people who needed to show they understood certain protocols, certain hierarchies, certain unspoken rules. The fact that this man recognized it meant he'd moved in those same circles, which meant he was exactly the kind of person she should avoid. May poked her head through the pass-through. "Everything okay out there? Those boys trouble?" "No trouble," Nora said. "Just passing through." "Mm-hmm." May's skeptical tone suggested she didn't believe that for a second. "Well, you holler if you need anything." Nora carried the tray back to the table, set down the cups and plates with practiced efficiency, and started to leave. "Sit down," the man said. It wasn't a request. Nora looked at the empty space in the booth, then at him. "I'm working. Your boss is in the kitchen. Your only other customer just left. Sit down, please." He added the last word as an afterthought, as if remembering that normal social interactions required such courtesies. She sat, perching on the edge of the vinyl seat, ready to move if necessary. The man took a sip of his coffee, his eyes never leaving her face. "I'm going to ask you a question, and I'd like an honest answer. I might not be able to give you one." A slight smile touched his lips, the first real expression she'd seen from him. "Honest. I appreciate that." He set down his cup. How does a waitress in an Arizona diner know a greeting used by the Takeda Gumi? Nora's blood turned cold. The Takeda Gumi, a name she hadn't heard spoken aloud in 3 years. A name that was connected to events she'd sworn to never discuss, operations that officially never happened, and consequences that were still playing out in ways she probably didn't even know. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but even she could hear how hollow the words sounded. "Yes," he said quietly, "you do. And now we have a problem, Nora. Because that greeting is not something you learn by accident. It's not in books or movies. It's passed down, person to person in very specific circumstances. So either you're somehow connected to an organization most people don't even know exists, or you learned it from someone who was. Either way, that makes you interesting. He leaned forward slightly and she saw something in his eyes that was neither threatening nor kind, just absolutely focused. And I don't like interesting people appearing in my life by coincidence, he continued. So I'm going to sit here and finish my coffee and this excellent pie, and then I'm going to wait until your shift ends. And then you and I are going to have a longer conversation about how a young American woman came to learn something that even many of my own people have never been taught. Nora's mind calculated options. She could run, grab her bag from the back, get in her car, and be gone before they made it to the parking lot. She could lie, come up with some story that would satisfy him enough to leave her alone. She could fight. She knew how, had been trained by some of the best. But fighting meant escalation, and escalation meant consequences. Or she could do what some deep instinct was telling her. She could trust that this moment, this recognition wasn't random, that maybe, just maybe, the past she'd been running from had found her for a reason. "Who are you?" she asked. He extended his hand across the table. "My name is Enzo Bellini, and I think you and I have more in common than either of us might prefer." Nora looked at his outstretched hand, seeing in that simple gesture a bridge between her carefully constructed present and the buried past. If she took his hand, if she acknowledged this connection, she would be opening a door she'd locked 3 years ago. But she'd learned something in her years of service. Sometimes the past doesn't let you run. Sometimes it finds you in a diner in the middle of the desert, recognizes a forgotten gesture, and demands answers you thought you'd never have to give. She reached out and shook his hand. His grip was firm, his skin warm despite the air conditioning. "Nora Blake," she said, "former military intelligence. And yes, I know what that greeting means. I know what it represents. And if you recognized it, then you know exactly what kind of trouble we might both be in." Enzo Bellini's smile widened, though his eyes remained serious. "Indeed I do, which is why we should talk somewhere more private than this diner. I have a feeling this conversation is going to take more than one cup of coffee." Outside, the desert sun continued its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The mountains threw long shadows across the sand. And in a forgotten diner on a lonely highway, two people from very different worlds sat across from each other, connected by a gesture that should have remained forgotten, about to embark on a conversation that would change both their lives. The bell above the door chimed as another customer entered. A family with 2 young children chattering excitedly about finding a real vintage diner. Nora stood, smoothing her apron. "I need to work. My shift ends at 8. "I'll wait," Enzo said simply. And as Nora moved to greet the new customers, pasting on her practiced smile and falling into her familiar routine, she felt the weight of his attention on her back. The comfortable anonymity she'd built over 3 years had just shattered like glass under pressure. Her quiet life, she realized, had just ended. Whether that was a tragedy or an opportunity remained to be seen. The sky had turned deep indigo by the time the last customer left. Nora watched the taillights disappear down the highway, red dots shrinking until they were swallowed by the desert darkness. The family with the 2 children had stayed longer than expected, the parents lingering over coffee while their kids colored on paper placemats with crayons May kept in a basket by the register. Normal people, doing normal things, completely unaware that 3 men in the corner booth were patiently waiting for something far from normal. The clock above the kitchen door read 7:53 p.m. 7 minutes until the end of her shift. 7 minutes until whatever came next. Nora had spent the past 4 hours moving through her routine in a state of heightened awareness that exhausted her more than any physical labor could. Every time she'd approached Enzo's table to refill coffee or check if they needed anything, she'd felt his eyes studying her, not with obvious intensity but with the patient observation of someone who made his living reading people. His 2 companions had barely spoken. They'd eaten their pie, drunk their coffee, and maintained a silent vigil that spoke of professional discipline. One had stepped outside twice to make phone calls, speaking in low tones that didn't carry through the windows. The other had simply sat, his attention rotating between the parking lot, the highway, and Nora herself. May emerged from the kitchen, untying her apron and hanging it on the hook by the pass-through. Her sharp eyes swept the diner, landing on the occupied booth with the kind of knowing look that came from decades of witnessing human nature in all its complexity. "You need me to stick around?" she asked quietly, coming to stand beside Nora at the counter. It was a loaded question. May was asking if Nora felt unsafe, if she needed backup, if these men represented a threat that required intervention. No, Nora said, surprised to find she meant it. I'll be fine. Those boys don't look like regular customers. They're not. You know them? Not exactly. Nora met May's concerned gaze. But I think I need to talk to them. About things from before I came here. May studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Your business is your business, hun. Always has been. But you've got my number if you need it. Frank's too. She paused, her weathered hand touching Nora's arm briefly. You've been a good employee, Nora. Quiet, reliable, never any trouble. Whatever you're mixed up in, I hope you come out the other side okay? The simple kindness in May's voice made Nora's throat tighten. She'd worked hard to keep emotional distance from everyone here, to remain professional but detached. But May had been fair to her, had asked no questions and demanded no explanations, and that deserved acknowledgement. Thank you, Nora said, for everything, for giving me a chance when I needed one. Everyone deserves a chance, May replied. She collected her purse from under the counter, called a goodbye to the men in the booth who nodded politely in return, and headed out the front door. Her old pickup truck started with a familiar rattle, and then she too disappeared into the night. The diner felt different in the silence that followed, larger somehow and more exposed. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in their particular shade of artificial brightness. Outside, the darkness was absolute. No streetlights this far from town, just the vast emptiness of the desert stretching in all directions. Nora flipped the sign on the door to closed and turned the lock. The click seemed unnaturally loud. Would you like more coffee? She asked, though all three men still had half-full cups. No, thank you, Enzo said, but you should pour one for yourself. This conversation will be easier if we're all comfortable. Comfortable, as if anything about this situation was comfortable. But Nora poured herself a cup anyway, added cream and sugar, luxuries she never indulged in during work hours, and walked over to their booth. She slid into the opposite bench, next to the silent companion who shifted slightly to give her space. Up close, Enzo looked tired in a way that his expensive suit and composed demeanor almost hid. There were lines around his eyes, a tension in his jaw that suggested he carried burdens that never fully lifted. He was, she estimated, somewhere in his early to mid-40s, but he had the air of someone who'd lived longer than his years. Your colleagues, Nora said, gesturing to the two other men. Are they going to be part of this conversation? Marco and Vincent are here to ensure our discussion remains private, Enzo replied smoothly. They won't interfere unless necessary. And what would make it necessary? If you tried to run, if you tried to call for help, if you attempted to harm me. He said it matter-of-factly without threat, just stating conditions. But I don't think you'll do any of those things. You could have run hours ago. You didn't. He was right, of course. She'd had multiple opportunities to disappear. The fact that she'd stayed meant something, though she wasn't entirely sure what yet. So, Enzo continued, wrapping both hands around his coffee cup in a gesture that seemed almost contemplative. Let's start with the obvious question. How does someone like you, young, American, working in a roadside diner, come to know a greeting used exclusively within the Takeda Gumi? Nora took a sip of her coffee, buying time to organize her thoughts. How much should she tell him? How much did he already know? And most importantly, how much could she afford to reveal without exposing herself to even more complications? I was military intelligence, she said finally. Army, stationed in Okinawa for 18 months about 4 years ago. My unit worked on cultural liaison projects, building relationships between U.S. forces and local communities. Cultural liaison. Enzo's tone suggested he recognized the euphemism. That's an interesting way to describe intelligence gathering. It was legitimate work, Nora said, though even she could hear the defensive edge in her voice. We were trying to improve cooperation, reduce friction. The base had been having issues with local organizations, and someone decided that better understanding might help. And this better understanding involved learning Yakuza protocols. Some of the local business leaders we worked with had complicated backgrounds, connections that weren't immediately obvious. One of our contacts, a man who ran a shipping company, took it upon himself to teach me things he said would help me navigate certain social situations more smoothly. It was the truth, just not all of it. The truth was messier, involved classified operations and information that had come with a security clearance she no longer possessed, and consequences she was still trying to understand. Enzo was quiet for a moment, his dark eyes searching her face. "This contact of yours, did he have a name?" "Several, probably. I knew him as Tanaka-san." Something flickered across Enzo's expression. Recognition, perhaps, or confirmation of a suspicion. "And what happened to make you leave the military and end up here 3 years later, serving pie to strangers?" This was the dangerous part. The part where the official story and the actual events diverged sharply. "My unit ran into problems," Nora said carefully. "There was an operation that didn't go as planned. People got hurt. Not physically," she added quickly, seeing the companion named Marco tense slightly. "But careers ended. Reputations were damaged. I was told it would be better for everyone if I separated from service quietly." "Better for everyone," Enzo repeated. "Or better for someone specific who needed a convenient person to blame." Nora looked down at her coffee. "Does it matter?" "It might." Enzo leaned back against the vinyl booth. "Because if you were pushed out to protect someone else, that means you know something. And if you know something, that means you're potentially either valuable or dangerous, depending on perspective." "I'm neither," Nora said firmly. "I'm just someone who wanted to disappear and start over, that's all." "No one who knows a Takeda Gumi greeting is just someone," Enzo countered. "That knowledge, that specific gesture, it represents connections, history, obligations. You may not want those things to follow you, but they do." Nora felt frustration rising in her chest. "Then maybe you should explain why you recognized it. How does an Italian businessman," she gestured at his expensive suit, "come to know about Japanese organized traditions?" "Who said I was a businessman?" "Your suit did. Your car did. The way your friends here position themselves did. You carry yourself like someone used to authority, someone people listen to and follow. That's either corporate or—" She let the sentence trail off. "Or," Enzo prompted, "or something else entirely." A smile tugged at the corner of Enzo's mouth. "You're observant. That's good. Yes, I'm involved in business, import-export primarily. My family has operations on both coasts, partnerships throughout Asia and Europe. Some of these partnerships go back generations, including partnerships with the Takeda Gumi. Once upon a time, yes." Enzo's expression grew more serious. "My father believed in building bridges between organizations that operated in similar spaces. He thought that cooperation was more profitable than conflict. 20 years ago, he arranged a meeting with representatives from several groups, including the Takeda Gumi. I was young then, barely in my 20s, but I attended. I watched. I learned. And the greeting was taught to me by an older member of the organization, a man who believed that respect should be shown even between different cultures and different methods of operation. He said that understanding how others showed honor was the first step to building trust." Nora heard the past tense in his phrasing. "What happened to that partnership?" "What always happens when people try to operate in gray areas," Enzo said quietly. "Someone decided that cooperation looked too much like weakness. There was a disagreement about territory, about respect, about old obligations and new ambitions. Things became complicated. The partnership dissolved. Some relationships ended badly. And now I run my family's operations differently than my father did, more cautiously, with fewer outside connections and more attention to potential complications." He fixed her with a steady gaze. "Which is why I find it fascinating that you appear here, in the middle of nowhere, carrying knowledge that connects to one of those old complications." "It's not connected," Nora insisted. "What I learned in Okinawa had nothing to do with your family's business." "Are you certain about that?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications Nora didn't want to examine too closely. Marco, who had been silent throughout the conversation, leaned forward and murmured something in Italian to Enzo. Nora caught only a few words. Her language training had included basic Italian, though she was far from fluent, but the tone was cautious, almost warning. Enzo nodded slowly, then checked his watch. "It's getting late. Perhaps we should continue this conversation somewhere more comfortable. There's a hotel about 20 miles north of here." "I'm not going to a hotel with you," Nora interrupted. "I wasn't suggesting we share a room," Enzo said dryly. "I meant that we could continue talking in a more private setting. The parking lot of a closed diner isn't ideal for the kind of discussion we're having." "I have an apartment," Nora said, surprising herself with the offer. "Above the diner. Small but private." It was a calculated risk. Inviting them into her personal space would give them information about her, how she lived, what she kept, what her escape routes were, but it also kept things on her territory, gave her some measure of control, and avoided getting into a vehicle with 3 men she didn't fully trust. Enzo considered this. That would be acceptable. Marco, Vincent, wait in the car. Keep watch. The 2 men stood without question, nodded to Nora with surprising courtesy, and headed for the door. Through the window, she watched them take positions near a black SUV parked at the far end of the lot, their postures alert, but not aggressive. You trust them completely, Nora observed. With my life, Enzo confirmed. They've been with me for years. Loyalty like that is rare and valuable. Nora led him through the kitchen. May had cleaned everything before leaving, and the stainless steel surfaces gleamed in the overhead lights, to a back door that opened onto a narrow external staircase. The metal stairs clanged under their feet as they climbed to the 2nd floor. Her apartment was exactly what it appeared to be, a temporary stopping point, not a home. The single room contained a bed, a small table with 2 chairs, a kitchenette with a hot plate and mini fridge, and a bathroom barely large enough to turn around in. The walls were bare except for a calendar from 2 years ago that had come with the place. No photographs, no personal items, nothing that would give any insight into who she was or where she'd come from. Enzo took in the Spartan conditions without comment, though she saw something shift in his expression. Recognition, perhaps. He understood what this room represented. Not poverty, but purposeful emptiness. A place to sleep, nothing more. You don't plan to stay, he said. I never plan to stay anywhere. Nora closed the door, left it unlocked. Always maintain an exit route. Would you like water? I'm afraid I don't have much else to offer. Water is fine. She poured 2 glasses from the tap. The desert water was heavily mineral but drinkable, and sat at the small table. Enzo took the other chair, which wobbled slightly on uneven legs. For a moment they just looked at each other. The harsh overhead light cast shadows under his eyes, made the gray in his hair more prominent. He looked less intimidating here, more human. Just a tired man having a strange conversation in a stranger's empty apartment. Why are you really here? Nora asked. Not at the diner. I know that was probably random. But why did you stay after you recognized the greeting? Why does it matter to you? Enzo was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing patterns on the side of his water glass. Because 3 weeks ago, he finally said, I received a message from someone I haven't heard from in nearly a decade. Someone who was part of those old partnerships, those old complications I mentioned. The message was simple. The past is coming due. Prepare yourself. A chill ran down Nora's spine. What does that mean? I don't know, but I've learned to take warnings seriously, especially from people who only speak when silence becomes more dangerous than speech. I've been careful, watching for signs, for connections, for anything unusual. He gestured around the sparse room. And then today, in a random diner I stopped at because my driver needed fuel, I see a young woman perform a gesture that should be impossible for her to know. You can understand why that got my attention. You think I'm connected to your warning. I think coincidences are rare. I think the universe doesn't usually put puzzle pieces in front of you without reason. He leaned forward. So I'll ask you directly. Is there any reason someone from that old world, from the Takeda Gumi or organizations connected to them, would be looking for you? Nora's hands tightened around her water glass. This was the question she'd been dreading, the one that connected her carefully buried past to an uncertain and potentially dangerous present. There might be, she admitted quietly. Tell me. And so she did. Not everything. Some secrets were still too classified, too dangerous to speak aloud. But enough. She told him about the operation in Okinawa, about information her unit had gathered regarding connections between U.S. contractors and various Asian organizations. She told him about the ambush that wasn't supposed to happen, about how her entire team had been compromised and how she'd been the only one to get out. She told him about the debriefing that became an interrogation, about superiors who seemed more interested in containing information than understanding what went wrong. They said it was my fault, she said, her voice steady despite the memories clawing at her. Said I'd failed to properly vet our contacts, that I'd been manipulated, that my judgment was compromised. Maybe they were right, but I know, that someone higher up the chain had been feeding information to the people who hit us. Someone wanted that operation to fail. And you have proof of this? I have suspicions. Documents that don't quite add up. Timelines that don't match official reports. Nothing concrete enough to take to anyone. Nothing that wouldn't make me look paranoid or vindictive. She met his eyes. But enough that certain people would prefer I stay quiet and forgotten. And one of those people, Enzo said slowly, Might have connections to the same organizations I'm worried about. It's possible. Enzo stood, walked to the small window that looked out over the dark parking lot. His security team was visible as shadows near their vehicle. "This is more complicated than I thought," he said. "Welcome to my life." He turned back to her, and in his expression she saw something she recognized. The weight of carrying knowledge that couldn't be shared, of making decisions that affected others, of trying to navigate waters where the wrong move could have consequences that rippled far beyond yourself. "I have resources," he said carefully. "People who owe me favors, connections in various places, access to information that doesn't appear in official channels. If someone is looking for you, if your past is indeed catching up, I might be able to help." "Why would you do that?" "Because if your past and my warning are connected, then helping you helps me. Because I don't like the idea of someone being pushed aside to protect people who should be held accountable. And because," he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully, "because I recognize what I see in you. Someone trying to survive while carrying burdens that shouldn't be theirs alone." It was, Nora realized, the kindest thing anyone had said to her in 3 years. Before she could respond, Enzo's phone rang. He glanced at the screen and his expression shifted, something between concern and grim confirmation. "Yes?" He listened, his face growing more serious with each passing second. "When? How certain?" "I understand. No, stay there. I'll call you back." He ended the call and looked at Nora with eyes that had gone cold and calculating. "We have a problem," he said. "That was my contact in Phoenix. A man arrived in town this afternoon, asking questions. Specifically, he's asking about anyone connected to old Japanese business interests in the Southwest. He's been making inquiries at places where people like me would be noticed." Nora felt her stomach drop. "Who is he?" "My contact didn't get a name, but the description matches someone I knew years ago. Someone who worked as a facilitator between various organizations, including the Takeda Gumi. Someone who would only surface if something significant was happening." "And you think he's looking for you?" "I think he's looking for connections, links, people who might know things or have access to information." Enzo's eyes locked onto hers. "I think he's casting a net, and we might both be swimming in it." The room suddenly felt smaller, the darkness outside more threatening. For 3 years, Nora had successfully stayed off everyone's radar. Now, in the space of a single afternoon, everything was collapsing. "What do we do?" she asked. "We?" Enzo raised an eyebrow. "A few hours ago, you wanted nothing to do with me. That was before someone started asking questions in Phoenix. Before your warning and my past started looking like they might be the same thing." Nora stood, faced him directly. "If there's trouble coming, I'd rather face it with information and allies than alone in the dark. Even if those allies operate in spaces your training probably taught you to avoid. I've learned that the world isn't as simple as my training suggested, that sometimes the people who operate in the shadows do so because the light is too compromised to trust." She took a breath. "So yes, even then." Enzo studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, then we start by finding out exactly who's asking questions and why. I'll make some calls, activate some resources. You should pack a bag, just essentials. We might need to move quickly." "Move where?" "I have a place outside Phoenix. Secure, private, off any official records. We can use it as a base while we figure out what's happening and how to address it." "You're asking me to leave with you? To trust you?" "Yes. I don't know you." "No," Enzo agreed. "But you know that gesture you made today. You know what it represents. Honor, respect, recognition of codes that go deeper than law or official authority. I was taught that when someone shows that sign, they're acknowledging something important. So I'm asking you to trust that teaching, if not me personally, at least until we understand what we're dealing with." Nora looked around her empty apartment. There was nothing here worth staying for. No roots, no connections, no reason to remain except habit and the thin illusion of safety that was already crumbling. "All right," she said. "Give me 10 minutes." She pulled a duffel bag from under the bed, always packed, always ready, old military habits never dying, and did a quick inventory. Clothes, toiletries, cash, a burner phone she'd never activated, documents in a name that wasn't quite hers but could be if necessary. Everything she owned that mattered fit in one bag. She tried not to think about how sad that was. When she emerged from the bathroom, Enzo was standing by the window, phone to his ear, speaking in rapid Italian. He glanced at her, nodded, and finished his conversation. "Ready?" he asked. "As I'll ever be." They descended the stairs together. the metal clanging beneath their feet sounding like a countdown to something inevitable. Marco and Vincent materialized from the shadows as they approached the SUV, taking Nora's bag and stowing it in the back with efficient movements. Nora took one last look at the diner. Through the dark windows, she could see the counter where she'd spent countless hours, the booths where strangers had come and gone, the life she'd built that was simple and small and safe. Regrets? Enzo asked quietly. Always, Nora said, but they never change anything. She climbed into the SUV. Enzo slid in beside her. The engine started with a smooth purr, and they pulled onto the empty highway heading north toward Phoenix and whatever waited there. The desert stretched out on all sides, vast and dark and indifferent to human concerns. Somewhere out there, someone was asking questions. Someone from a past that refused to stay buried. Someone who might hold answers to mysteries Nora had tried to stop thinking about. "Tell me about this contact who's making inquiries," Nora said as the diner's lights faded in the rearview mirror. "Everything you know." Enzo turned to her, his face half lit by the dashboard glow. "His name is Richard Chen, and if he's involved, then this is more serious than I thought." "Why?" "Because Richard Chen doesn't ask questions unless he already knows the answers. He tests people, checks their loyalty, confirms suspicions." Enzo's voice was grim. "If he's looking for us, it means someone sent him. Someone who wants to know what we know and what we might do with that knowledge." The highway stretched ahead, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the darkness. Behind them, Nora's quiet life receded into memory. Ahead, uncertainty waited with questions that demanded answers. Her 3 years of peace had ended not with a bang, but with a bow, and now she had to figure out how to survive what came next. The safe house sat 40 minutes outside Phoenix, nestled in a canyon where the desert met the foothills. Nora had dozed fitfully during the drive, jerking awake every time the SUV changed speed or direction, old instincts never letting her fully relax in the presence of strangers. Now, as dawn painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, she stood on the covered patio and tried to make sense of how drastically her life had shifted in less than 12 hours. The house itself was modest, single-story, Pueblo-style architecture that blended into the surrounding landscape. Solar panels gleamed on the roof, and she'd noticed the sophisticated security system as they'd entered. Cameras, motion sensors, reinforced doors. This wasn't just a vacation property. This was a place designed for people who needed to disappear. "Coffee's ready," Enzo called from inside. Nora turned from her contemplation of the desert sunrise and entered through the sliding glass door. The interior was surprisingly comfortable. Leather furniture, southwestern art on the walls, a kitchen that looked actually used rather than staged. Marco and Vincent had taken positions in a separate guest house visible through the back windows, giving their boss privacy while remaining close enough to respond if needed. Enzo stood at the kitchen counter, pouring coffee into 2 mugs. He'd removed his suit jacket and rolled up his shirt sleeves, and without the formal armor of his expensive clothes, he looked more approachable, more human. The lines of stress around his eyes were more visible in the morning light. "Cream sugar?" he asked. "Both, please. Too many years of bad military coffee trained me to cover the taste." He prepared her cup and slid it across the counter. "I spoke with my people while you were resting. Richard Chen checked into the Phoenician Hotel late last night. He's scheduled meetings today with several business owners. Legitimate fronts for less legitimate operations. He's not being subtle. No. Which means either he wants us to know he's here, or he doesn't care who knows." Enzo took a sip of his own coffee, black and unsweetened. "My contact says Chen's been asking specifically about anyone connected to operations in Okinawa between 3 and 5 years ago." Nora's hand tightened around her mug. "That's my timeline. And mine. That's when my family's last dealings with the Takeda Gumi were being finalized, or rather, being dissolved. The partnership was ending, and not everyone was happy about it." "Tell me about that," Nora said, moving to sit at the breakfast bar. "You mentioned complications, but not details. What really happened?" Enzo was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old regrets. "My father, Antonio Bellini, believed in building bridges. He thought that in our line of work, import-export, logistics, facilitating the movement of goods that sometimes existed in gray areas of legality, cooperation was smarter than competition. In the late 90s, he established relationships with several organizations throughout Asia. The Takeda Gumi was one of them." "What kind of relationship?" "Information sharing primarily. Advance notice of regulatory changes. Introduction to reliable partners. Mutual assistance when operations intersected. Nothing that directly harmed anyone, but definitely nothing that would appear in official business filings. He set down his coffee. For almost 15 years it worked. Then my father had a heart attack. Survived it, but it changed him. Made him want to step back, simplify our operations. And not everyone agreed with that decision. My older brother Carlo thought it was weakness. He wanted to expand, not contract. Wanted to leverage our international connections for more aggressive ventures. Enzo's expression darkened. He started making promises my father never would have authorized, offering commitments that put us in deeper water than we'd ever been. Nora heard the pain beneath his carefully neutral tone. What happened to your brother? Carlo made a deal he couldn't keep. Promised access to shipping routes through West Coast ports that we didn't actually control. When he couldn't deliver, our partners felt betrayed. There was a confrontation at a meeting in San Francisco 4 years ago. Words were exchanged, threats made. Carlo left in anger and Enzo paused, visibly steadying himself. He had an accident on the drive home. His car went off a cliff on Highway 1. The official report said he fell asleep at the wheel. But you don't believe that. I don't know what I believe. The timing was convenient for some people, inconvenient for others. My father had a second heart attack when he heard the news. That one didn't leave him time to recover. He met Nora's eyes. So I inherited a business in crisis, partnerships that were crumbling, and questions I couldn't answer about whether my brother's accident was truly accidental. I'm sorry, Nora said, and meant it. Losing family like that, not knowing, it's its own kind of burden. Yes, Enzo's voice was quiet. Yes, it is. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of shared understanding settling between them. Both of them carried losses. Both bore scars from events they couldn't fully control or understand. Your turn, Enzo said finally. You told me the outline last night. Tell me the details now. What really happened in Okinawa? Nora took a long drink of coffee, buying time. She'd spent 3 years not talking about this, not thinking about it when she could avoid it. But if they were going to figure out why Richard Chen was asking questions, she needed to trust someone with the full story. I was Army intelligence, like I said. 24 years old, 2 years in service, assigned to the Cultural Liaison Unit because I'd tested well on language aptitude and showed what my evaluators called excellent interpersonal instincts. She smiled without humor. Turns out I was good at getting people to trust me. A useful skill in intelligence work. A dangerous one, as it turned out. My unit's official mission was building relationships with local business leaders and community figures around Kadena Air Base. Unofficially, we were gathering information about economic activities that might intersect with security concerns. Money laundering, smuggling routes, connections between legitimate businesses and less legitimate organizations. And you were successful? Too successful. I established a relationship with a logistics coordinator named Kenji Tanaka. He ran a shipping company that serviced both commercial and military contracts. Smart, educated in the States, spoke perfect English. He seemed genuinely interested in improving U.S.-Japanese relations. Nora's voice grew distant, remembering. He was also connected to the Takeda Gumi through his uncle. Not deeply involved in their operations, but close enough to have knowledge and access. And he shared that knowledge with you. Not at first. For months, our relationship was purely professional. Then one evening, after a cultural event at the base, he asked if I wanted to learn about real Japanese business practices. Not the sanitized version they taught at the embassy, but how things actually worked. I should have reported it immediately. Should have recognized it as a potential recruitment attempt. But you didn't. I was curious, young, arrogant enough to think I could manage the situation and get valuable intelligence without crossing lines I shouldn't cross. She shook her head at her younger self's naivete. Tanaka introduced me to people, taught me protocols, like that greeting you recognized, explained the hierarchies, the obligations, the unwritten rules that governed certain business relationships. And in return, I provided what seemed like harmless information, general observations about base operations, nothing classified. But intelligence is rarely about single pieces of information, Enzo said. It's about patterns, connections. Exactly. I didn't realize I was being played until it was too late. Someone was using the information I provided to coordinate operations that worked around military security. Nothing dramatic, just small adjustments in timing, routes, methods, but it added up. And when you discovered this, I reported it through proper channels, told my commanding officer everything. I thought I was doing the right thing. Nora's laugh was bitter. Instead, they pulled me into a conference room and told me I'd compromised operational security, that my contact with Tanaka had violated protocols, that any intelligence I'd gathered was tainted by the method of collection. They were covering something up. That's what I came to believe, because shortly after my report, my entire team was reassigned to a joint operation with Japanese authorities, a raid on a warehouse suspected of housing contraband. It was supposed to be straightforward. We had intelligence, we had local support, we had authorization from both governments. Enzo leaned forward. What went wrong? Everything. We arrived at the warehouse to find it empty except for crates of legitimate merchandise. But we'd been spotted, and word got back to people who weren't happy about foreign military conducting operations on their territory. There was a confrontation, not physical but intense. Diplomatic implications. My team leader tried to de-escalate, but things got heated. Accusations were thrown around, jurisdictional arguments, suggestions that we'd been deliberately fed false information to create an international incident. Someone set you up? Yes. But who and why I've never been able to prove. My unit was disbanded within a week. Team members were scattered to different assignments. I was brought before a review board and told that while my intentions might have been good, my judgment was fatally flawed. They offered me a choice: accept a general discharge and separation benefits or face formal proceedings that would likely end with a less favorable outcome. So you took the discharge. I took it because I was tired, because I couldn't prove what I suspected, because the alternative was fighting a system that had already decided I was the problem. Nora met his eyes. And because Tanaka sent me a message the day before I left Okinawa. He said he was sorry, that things had gotten complicated and that I should disappear for a while. Let things settle. Did he explain what he meant? No, I never heard from him again. I've looked, carefully, using methods that wouldn't attract attention. As far as I can tell, Kenji Tanaka no longer exists. His shipping company was dissolved, his properties sold, his connections severed. He vanished as completely as I tried to. Enzo was quiet, processing this information. Outside, the desert morning was heating up, the temperature already climbing toward the day's peak. There's a connection here, he said finally, between what happened to you and what happened to my family's partnerships. The timeline matches. Both situations deteriorated around the same period. Both involved the Takeda Gumi. Both ended with people disappearing or being silenced. You think someone orchestrated both situations? I think someone benefited from both situations falling apart. Someone who wanted certain relationships disrupted. Certain people removed from positions where they had knowledge or influence. Richard Chen, perhaps, or someone Chen works for. Enzo stood, pacing the kitchen with controlled energy. Chen is a facilitator, a middleman. He doesn't act on his own initiative. If he's here asking questions, it's because someone hired him to gather information or confirm suspicions. But why now? It's been years. If someone wanted us silenced, they had plenty of opportunities before this. Unless something changed, unless new information surfaced, or old secrets became suddenly relevant again. Enzo pulled out his phone, scrolling through messages. I need to make some calls. People who might know what's shifting in the background. Can you give me an hour? Of course. He disappeared into one of the back bedrooms, and Nora found herself alone with her thoughts in the desert silence pressing in from all sides. She wandered through the house, noting details. The bookshelves held an eclectic mix: business texts, Italian literature, biographies of historical figures. The art on the walls leaned toward abstract expressionism, bold colors and emotional brushstrokes. A photograph on a side table showed a younger Enzo with an older couple, his parents presumably, and another man who must have been Carlo. They were smiling, arms around each other, captured in a moment before tragedy reshaped their family. In the guest room Enzo had indicated was hers. Nora unpacked her single duffel bag. The act of putting her few possessions into drawers and closets felt strange, temporary. She'd spent 3 years living out of that bag, never settling anywhere long enough to justify unpacking. Now, in a safe house with a man she'd met yesterday, she was organizing socks and t-shirts as if this were normal. Nothing about this was normal. Her phone, the legitimate one, not the burner, buzzed with a message. May, checking in. Hope everything's okay, hun. If you need anything, let me know. Nora stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back. Everything's fine. Thank you for everything. I might need to be away for a while. Personal matters. May's response came quickly. Take all the time you need. Your job will be here if you want to come back. If, not when. May was perceptive enough to recognize that Nora's departure might be permanent. Nora set the phone aside and sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly exhausted despite having slept in the car. The adrenaline that had carried her through the night was fading, leaving behind the reality of her situation. She'd left her safe anonymity, trusted a stranger with information she'd protected for years, and was now waiting in a safe house while that stranger made calls to people she probably didn't want to know about. And yet, she didn't regret it. For 3 years, she'd been running from questions she couldn't answer and ghosts she couldn't face. Now maybe she'd finally get some resolution. Even if that resolution brought complications, at least it would be movement, progress, something other than the static limbo of hiding. A knock on her door pulled her from her thoughts. Enzo stood in the hallway, his expression troubled. "I have information," he said. "Some of it good, most of it concerning. Can you come to the office?" The office was a converted bedroom with a desk, computer equipment, and a large map of the western United States pinned to one wall. Various locations were marked with different colored pins. His business operations, Nora assumed, or locations relevant to his concerns. "What did you learn?" she asked. "Richard Chen isn't working alone. He has a partner, an American, former CIA, now works as a private security consultant. His name is James Hartwick." The name hit Nora like a physical blow. She gripped the edge of the desk to steady herself. "You know him," Enzo observed. "He was the CIA liaison to my unit in Okinawa, the one who coordinated information sharing between military intelligence and other agencies." Her voice came out strained. "He was also the one who debriefed me after the warehouse incident, who recommended I take the discharge. And you think he was involved in setting you up? I've suspected for 3 years. But suspicion isn't proof, and I had no way to investigate without exposing myself." Enzo pulled up a file on his computer. Surveillance photos of 2 men entering a Phoenix office building. One was Asian, middle-aged, carrying himself with the quiet confidence of someone comfortable in any environment. The other was Anglo, early 50s, with the fit build and alert posture of someone who'd maintained military discipline. "Chen and Hartwick," Enzo confirmed. "Photographed this morning outside a private security firm downtown. My contact says they met with the firm's CEO for 2 hours, then left together." "What kind of security firm?" "The kind that provides protective services for high-value clients operating in complicated situations. The kind that doesn't ask many questions about where their assignments come from or what they actually involve." Nora studied the photographs, her mind racing. "They're building a team. Whatever they're planning, they need operational support. That's my assessment as well, which means we need to understand their objective before they achieve it." Enzo turned to face her fully. "Nora, I need to know. Is there anything you haven't told me? Any information you have, any evidence you kept, anything that might explain why Hartwick is suddenly interested in finding you after 3 years of apparent disinterest?" She hesitated. This was the moment of complete trust or continued secrecy. She could hold back, keep her last cards close, maintain some measure of personal security, or she could take the risk of full disclosure and hope that sharing everything would give them the information they needed to survive what was coming. "There's a flash drive," she said quietly. "Encrypted. I copied files from my unit's server before I left Okinawa. Communication logs, intelligence reports, financial transaction records. Nothing I fully understood at the time, but I knew enough to recognize patterns that didn't make sense." Enzo's eyes widened slightly. "You've had classified intelligence in your possession for 3 years? In a safety deposit box in Flagstaff, under a name that isn't mine. I've never accessed it, never tried to decrypt it, never told anyone it existed." She met his gaze steadily. "Because I knew that the moment I looked at those files, I'd be making a choice. And I wasn't ready to make that choice." "What changed?" "You recognized a greeting that should have remained forgotten. Richard Chen appeared asking questions about Okinawa. James Hartwick, the man who helped destroy my career, is working with him." She straightened her shoulders. "I'm tired of running from questions I might be able to answer. If those files contain evidence of what really happened, evidence that could expose whoever orchestrated all of this, then maybe it's time to look." "It's a 3-hour drive to Flagstaff," Enzo said. "We'd be exposed, traveling in daylight, potentially moving into territory Chen and Hartwick might be watching." "I know. If those files contain what you think they contain, we become immediate targets. Not just for Chen and Hartwick, but for anyone else who wants that information buried." "I know that too." Enzo studied her for a long moment. then nodded slowly. All right, we go to Flagstaff. We retrieve the drive. We find out what secrets you've been carrying. He pulled out his phone. But we do it smart. Multiple vehicles, staggered departure times, counter-surveillance protocols. Marco and Vincent will provide security, and we prepare for the possibility that this trip changes everything. It already has, Nora said. Yesterday I was serving coffee. Today I'm planning a covert operation with someone I barely know. Everything's already changed. Fair point. A slight smile touched Enzo's lips, the first genuine expression of humor she'd seen from him. Though I'd argue your coffee-serving days were always temporary. You don't strike me as someone built for permanent anonymity. Neither do you. No. We're both too aware, too trained, too marked by our experiences to truly disappear. We can hide, but we can't forget. And eventually, that catches up with us. 30 minutes later, they were in motion. Enzo had made arrangements with precision that spoke of long practice and careful planning. Marco would drive one of the SUVs with Nora as passenger, taking the direct route to Flagstaff. Enzo and Vincent would follow 20 minutes behind in a different vehicle, providing backup and monitoring for surveillance. If anything went wrong, they had contingency plans and fallback positions. As they pulled onto the highway heading north, Nora watched the desert landscape roll past and tried to prepare herself for what they might find in those encrypted files. For 3 years, she'd lived with the weight of not knowing, of suspecting, but never confirming. Soon, that uncertainty would end. Whether that ending brought resolution or catastrophe remained to be seen. But at least, finally, she'd be moving forward instead of hiding. Beside her, Marco drove with professional competence, his eyes constantly scanning mirrors and surroundings. He hadn't spoken much, but his presence was oddly comforting. Someone whose job was simply to protect, to maintain security, to ensure nothing went wrong. Nora's phone buzzed. A message from Enzo in the following vehicle. ETA Flagstaff 11:30. Stay alert. Trust your instincts. She typed back. Understood. The highway stretched ahead, cutting through red rock country and pine forests, climbing in elevation as they left the desert heat behind. Somewhere ahead was a safety deposit box containing information that might explain years of questions. Somewhere behind them, Richard Chen and James Hartwick were conducting their own investigation, asking their own questions, building toward their own conclusions. 2 parallel tracks of inquiry, racing toward an inevitable intersection. Nora just hoped that when those tracks met, she'd be ready for the collision. The past was catching up, demanding acknowledgement and payment for old debts. She'd spent 3 years trying to outrun it. Now she was driving straight toward it, armed with nothing but determination and the uncertain alliance with a man who understood what it meant to survive in shadows. Outside, the desert gave way to mountains, and the road climbed higher into country where the air grew thin and perspectives shifted, where you could see for miles in every direction and know that visibility worked both ways. You could see threats coming, but threats could see you too. 30 minutes out, Marco said quietly, his first words in an hour. Good, Nora replied. Let's get this done. Whatever awaited them in Flagstaff, answers, danger, or something in between, she was ready to face it. The time for hiding had passed. The time for truth, no matter how complicated, had arrived. And somewhere in her encrypted files, that truth was waiting to be revealed. The bank in Flagstaff was unremarkable, a small branch tucked between a coffee shop and a bookstore on a quiet side street. Nora entered alone while Marco waited in the SUV, his eyes constantly scanning the surrounding area. Enzo and Vincent were parked 2 blocks away, maintaining overwatch. Inside, the cool air conditioning and hushed atmosphere felt surreal after days of tension. Nora presented her identification, the alternate identity she'd maintained for exactly this purpose, and was led to the vault by a polite clerk who asked no questions. The safety deposit box was small, unassuming. Inside, wrapped in a waterproof pouch, was the flash drive that had haunted her conscience for 3 years. 20 minutes later, they were back at the safe house, gathered around Enzo's computer, as the decryption software worked through layers of security Nora had installed. Her hands trembled slightly as she typed in the final password, a combination of coordinates from her last mission and her unit designation. The files opened. For the next 2 hours, they read in silence, broken only by occasional sharp intakes of breath as connections became clear. Communication log showed a pattern of information sharing between James Hartwick and multiple international contacts, including someone within the Takeda Gumi. Financial records revealed payments from a shell corporation linked to defense contractors, the same contractors who'd benefited when certain military operations were disrupted. He was selling information, Nora said, her voice hollow. Hartwick was feeding intelligence to multiple parties, playing all sides. My unit stumbled onto his operation, so he orchestrated the warehouse incident to discredit us. Enzo pulled up another file, his expression grim. And look at this. Payments to an intermediary named Chen, Richard Chen. He's been on Hartwick's payroll for years. But why surface now? Nora asked. Why come looking for us after all this time? The answer came from an email buried in the files, sent just weeks before Nora's discharge. Hartwick had written to an unknown recipient. The Bellini situation is resolved. Brother eliminated, father neutralized, son contained. Takeda partnership dissolved as requested. Blake remains a potential liability, but contained through discharge. We'll monitor. Nora looked at Enzo, saw the pain flash across his face as he read about his brother's elimination, described so casually. They arranged Carlo's accident, he said quietly. And my father's heart attack. I wonder now if that was truly natural. Enzo, I'm so sorry. He shook his head, forcing composure. What matters now is understanding why they're active again. There must be something new, some reason to revisit old operations. Marco appeared in the doorway, his face tense. Boss, we have a problem. Vincent spotted a surveillance team at the north access point. 2 vehicles, professional setup. They're watching the house. Enzo was on his feet instantly. How long? Just arrived. They're maintaining distance, but it's deliberate positioning. Nora's military training kicked in. They tracked us from Flagstaff. Must have had someone watching the bank. Or they already knew about the safety deposit box, Enzo said darkly. Hartwick had access to your files. He might have been monitoring it for years, waiting to see if you'd ever retrieve it. Then we walked right into their surveillance net. Nora felt anger rising. They wanted us to get the drive. They wanted to see what we'd do with it. Enzo moved to the window, carefully observing through a gap in the curtains. We need to move. Copy these files to multiple locations, cloud storage, secure servers. If something happens to us, this information needs to survive. Already on it, Marco said, pulling out a laptop. Nora's phone buzzed. Unknown number. She showed the screen to Enzo, who nodded. She answered on speaker. Ms. Blake. James Hartwick's voice was smooth, controlled. I believe we need to talk. About how you destroyed my career and arranged for people to be eliminated. Nora kept her voice steady. I think we're past talking. You're looking at old files without context. The situation was complicated. The situation was that you were a traitor. Enzo cut in. Selling information, manipulating operations, arranging accidents. We have the evidence, Hartwick. All of it. A pause. When Hartwick spoke again, his tone had shifted. Harder, more dangerous. Then you understand the position you're in. That evidence implicates powerful people. People who will go to considerable lengths to ensure it stays buried. Is that a threat? It's reality. But I'm offering an alternative. Meet with me. Bring the drive. We can arrange a solution that benefits everyone. You get to walk away. Start fresh somewhere with resources that make your diner job look like the poverty it was. All you have to do is hand over the files and forget what you've seen. Nora looked at Enzo, saw her own determination reflected in his eyes. No deal, she said. We're done being manipulated. Then you're choosing a very difficult path. I'll give you 12 hours to reconsider. After that, my associates will be forced to take more direct action. The line went dead. Enzo immediately started making calls, his voice rapid and commanding as he activated networks Nora could only guess at. Marco finished uploading files to encrypted servers scattered across 3 continents. Vincent reported that the surveillance teams were maintaining position, but not advancing. We need leverage, Nora said. If we just run, they'll keep hunting us. We need something that makes us more valuable alive than silenced. Enzo ended a call and turned to her. Agreed. And I think I know how to get it. But it requires taking a significant risk. What kind of risk? The kind where we stop running and start pushing back. Where we contact people Hartwick doesn't want contacted and share information he needs buried. He pulled up a contact list on his phone. I know journalists, lawyers, people with platforms and protection. If we distribute this information widely enough, fast enough, it becomes impossible to contain. That makes us immediate targets. We're already targets. This makes us survivors. He met her eyes. But I won't force you into this. You can walk away now, disappear again, and I'll handle it alone. Nora thought about 3 years of hiding, of looking over her shoulder, of living half a life because she was too afraid to claim a whole one. She thought about her team in Okinawa, about Enzo's brother, about all the people who'd been hurt by Hartwick's schemes. "I'm done hiding," she said. "Let's finish this." As night fell over the desert, they prepared their counteroffensive. Files were distributed, contacts were made, deadlines were set. By dawn, the information would be in the hands of people who could act on it, people with resources, authority, and motivation to expose the corruption. It was dangerous, potentially reckless, and absolutely necessary. Through the window, Nora could see the surveillance teams still maintaining their positions, waiting for orders, assuming their targets would eventually fold under pressure. They were wrong. The hunters were about to become the hunted, and by morning everything would change. Dawn broke over Phoenix with the kind of clarity that only comes after storms pass. Nora stood on the safe house patio, phone in hand, watching news alerts populate her screen. The story had broken an hour ago, major outlets simultaneously publishing exposés about corruption within private security contracting, CIA misconduct, and a web of manipulation spanning multiple countries and organizations. James Hartwick's name was everywhere, so was Richard Chen's. The evidence from Nora's flash drive, combined with additional documentation Enzo's contacts had provided, painted an undeniable picture. Federal investigators were already moving, warrants being issued, assets being frozen. The machinery of justice, slow but inexorable, had been set in motion. "It's done," Enzo said, joining her outside. He looked exhausted but relieved, the tension that had marked his features finally easing. "My attorney confirms that Hartwick was taken into custody an hour ago. Chen is cooperating, providing testimony in exchange for consideration. And us? We've been invited to provide formal statements to a federal task force, not as suspects, as witnesses. They want everything we know, everything we've experienced." He paused. "It's going to be complicated, probably take months to fully resolve, but we'll be protected throughout the process." Nora absorbed this, feeling something she hadn't experienced in 3 years. Hope. "My discharge will likely be reviewed. With evidence of Hartwick's manipulation, there's grounds for reinstatement or at minimum an honorable discharge with full benefits. It won't undo what happened, but it's acknowledgement that you weren't at fault." She nodded, unable to speak past the sudden tightness in her throat. They stood in companionable silence, watching the desert come alive with morning light. The surveillance teams had vanished during the night, recalled once their employers realized the situation was beyond containment. "What will you do now?" Nora asked eventually. Enzo considered the question. "Restructure. My family's business has always operated in gray areas, but there are ways to move toward clearer territory. It won't be easy, and not everyone in my organization will be happy about it. But my father's original vision, building bridges, facilitating legitimate commerce, that's worth pursuing. That's a big change. Long overdue." He looked at her. "And you? Back to the diner?" "I don't think so. May was kind to give me that refuge, but it was always temporary. I'm thinking about using my intelligence training for something constructive. There are organizations that help veterans transition, that investigate corruption, that work in spaces between official channels and need people who understand both worlds. That sounds like you'd be good at it." "Maybe. For the first time in years, I actually want to find out." Over the following weeks, they each navigated the aftermath. Testimony was given, statements were recorded, legal proceedings advanced with bureaucratic slowness. Enzo began the careful work of transforming his operations, making difficult decisions about personnel and priorities. Nora connected with advocacy organizations, finding purpose in helping others who'd been caught in systems that failed them. They stayed in contact, phone calls initially, then occasional meetings as their paths intersected. Not romance, but something deeper. Mutual respect forged through shared experience and validated trust. 6 months after that morning in the diner, Nora found herself back in Arizona. Not at the Route 66 location, that chapter had closed, but at a small cafe in downtown Phoenix where she'd arranged to meet Enzo. He arrived exactly on time, dressed casually in a way that would have been unthinkable when they first met. The expensive suits had given way to simpler clothes, and the weight he'd carried seemed lighter. "You look good," Nora said as he sat down. "You too. Healthy. Settled. Getting there." She smiled. "I heard your company just received a commendation from the Commerce Department. Legitimate trade facilitation between the US and Italy. That must feel good." "It does. Profit margins are lower, but I sleep better." He paused. And I heard you testified before Congress about intelligence oversight reform. That took courage. It took anger, mostly, but channeled productively for once. They talked easily, comparing notes on their transformations, sharing small victories and ongoing challenges. The conversation flowed with the comfort of people who'd seen each other at their worst and chosen to see the best instead. As they prepared to leave, Enzo held out his hand, the same gesture he'd made in the diner lifetimes ago. To new beginnings, he said. Nora took his hand, feeling the solid warmth of connection without obligation. To choosing to live instead of just survive. They parted ways on the street, each heading in different directions, carrying different purposes, but both moving forward, finally free from pasts that had demanded too much and given too little. The desert sun beat down on Phoenix, relentless and clarifying. Somewhere in the city, old stories were ending and new ones beginning, and two people who'd found each other through a forgotten gesture were writing chapters they could finally be proud of. Not perfect, not without scars, but authentic, purposeful, and genuinely theirs.